Yeah?
Yes.
So the first narrative in Maus, and certainly the one that's most identifiable, is the story of the survival of the Holocaust by a couple, Władek and Ania Spiegelman, two Polish Jews who married in 1937 and survived the Holocaust for the most part together, although they were separated for a time in Auschwitz and after liberation. And it's their story told by their son on the basis of interviews that they did with his father beginning in 1972, but the bulk of which came from the late 1970s and the early 1980s, actually right up until his father's death in 1982. The second narrative in Maus is the chronicle of Art coming to terms with his identity as a child of survivors, coming to understand not only who he is as a child of survivors, but understanding more about his parents as he interacts with his father in these interviews and learns more about his mother's and his father's history. And this is the narrative that connects Maus to this second generation literature, the literature produced by children of Holocaust survivors. The third narrative, and really very interesting in its own right, is the chronicle in Maus of Art Spiegelman's struggle to create Maus. Some of the difficulties he encounters in representing his parents' story to his reading public, as well as some of the ethical dilemmas that he has to confront and that he resolves, in ways that satisfy some people and don't satisfy others. Some of the ethical dilemmas he faces in telling the story of other people's, namely his parents' survival of the Holocaust. So, I think if you've read Maus, you probably have some recognition that these are narrative threads that run through Maus. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Harry, who's going to talk about the nature of Maus as a graphic novel.
Okay. So graphic novels communicate in words and pictures. They are comic books. And I know we're supposed to use the fancy term graphic novel, but actually Art Spiegelman himself has said he prefers the term comic book. It's more simple and direct, and why bother dressing it up with fancy terminology. So it's a combination of verbal and visual communication, but it is primarily a visual communicative mode. So when I start to teach this, I pose this question to my students. I want first to get into the visual imagery, the iconography, the symbols that are used. I think one of the reasons Maus works so profoundly successfully with my students is that it is a comic book. It's not just a comic book, it's a comic book about talking animals. And not just talking animals, but mice. So we all have these friendly Mickey Mouse associations with comic books about mice. I think this allows the story to get in under the radar of people's defenses. Even people who want to learn about the Holocaust, you say to them, we're going to learn about the Holocaust now, and sort of psychological defenses come up. I need to steel myself for the horrors to which I'm going to be exposed. And we have such deep associations with the comic book form, talking animal comic books, that I think it cuts through the defenses. And I've had students tell me over and over again that they've read other things about the Holocaust. Maybe they've read the Diary of Anne Frank. Maybe they've read other things. But somehow this story gets to them in a way that others don't. So I think the form of it is very much about how it communicates. So mouse uses the symbols of basically people, who look like people, but the heads are animals. So I put on the board, I asked my class to supply me with a bestiary, a list. What are the animals and what do they represent? So we start with, there are mice, they're the Jews. And then there are cats. And either they'll say Germans or they say Nazis, and I usually will ask them, well, which do you mean? Do you want to say Germans? Do you want to say Nazis? Sometimes I get both. And then I ask them, does the book make any differentiation? Are there German non-Nazis in the book? And they think a minute, and they say, no, the book treats Germans and Nazis as identical. They're all cats. I can file that information away. That's an important bit of information about the viewpoint of the book, which is already different from other viewpoints, because we sometimes hear people talking about, well, not all the Germans were Nazis. That's not the viewpoint of this book, and literally the viewpoint. Once you've got the Nazis or the Germans as cats, the imagery of the Americans as dogs is kind of natural, the antagonism between cats and dogs. The other major figures in the book are that Polish people are pigs. So there are other animals that come up just tangentially, sometimes for just a panel or so. Later in the book, British officers show up in just one panel sitting in a Jeep. You can identify them. There's a British flag on the Jeep. That's sort of a pun on fish and chips you associate with the British. There's a gypsy fortune teller, right, that is drawn as a moth, and Spiegelman is fond of visual puns, so I want to say, well, it's clearly a gypsy moth. So there are French people who are drawn as frogs. That's kind of a derogatory pun. Later in the book, they're in Sweden after the war. Those are elk. So these other creatures, but we've named the main four: cats, dogs, mice, and pigs. So then I ask my students, as I've gone through this list, Americans are dogs and Poles, pigs, and all that, I have paused and I said, now wait a minute, if they're American Jews or Polish Jews, are they mice or are they dogs or pigs? My students think, and then they're clear that the Jews are mice, no matter what their particular nationality. So now here's the sort of payoff question, having gone through this list of all the animals. Look what we've noticed. If you're a Jew, that trumps any other identity. Only then you're a mouse. Only if you're a non-Jew do we get into, are you a dog or a pig or a frog or whatever. So the fundamental way this book views the world is first, is someone a Jew or not Jew? That's the most essential thing. So now the payoff question, whose point of view is that? And we get to, that is Vladek's point of view. That's the point of view of Art Spiegelman's father. Well, that's an important bit of information. Sometimes what will come up is it's also the Nazis' point of view. And then we can have a conversation about, is it Art Spiegelman's view? How is that imposed on him, maybe, on the Nazis? But that's essential information that is conveyed in the graphic novel form. You can't convey that in a novel. You can't imagine a novelist writing a novel, and every time Vladek Spiegelman interacts with someone, there's a line that says, he's basically seeing this person as a Jew or a non-Jew. That's that you are literally drawn into Vladek's viewpoint in a very powerful and very subtle way. And I really mean drawn in. It's a drawn work, a graphic novel draws you into seeing the world through his eyes. That's the powerful way that a graphic novel communicates that you don't get in another medium. So let me go to a specific, really a specific page in Mouse, if we can call that up. The most reproduced image from Mouse, if it was a standard literary work, we'd say the most quoted page. It's visual. We would say the most reproduced page is actually the cover. It shows the mice sort of hiding under spotlight, swastika on the background. But this page we have up now Other than the cover image, this is the most reproduced page in the book, with good reason. Now, on my screen, it's too small for you to read the actual text. This is not typical of the visual imagery in the book, because instead of Art Spiegelman as drawing board with the mouse head, we have him wearing the mask of a mouse. So there is something going on. There's some issue about he feels masked, he feels distant from his identity, he's pretending, he's posing. There's something powerful being communicated by the departure from the usual representation. So up the top, this is the first page of Chapter 2 of Volume 2. The chapter title is Time Flies. Now normally, that's an expression. Time flies, meaning time moves quickly. But I said when I was talking about, Francis Frogs and Gypsy Moth, Spiegelman has a fondness for verbal visual puns. There's another way to read Time Flies, because we see actual flies in the image. So as opposed to time is a noun and flies is the verb, what it does, the way we would usually read it, you can also read it as flies is a noun and time is modifying flies. So if you ask what kind of flies these are, they are time flies. They are flies that fly through time. And indeed, that's what these flies are doing. We only get to know that at the bottom of the page. And what is going on this page is a sort of time travel. These are time flies traveling through time at such a dizzying speed. If you really follow it, you get sort of whiplash. In that first panel at the top, he tells us when Vladek died, then when Francoise, his wife, and he stayed with him. Then in the next panel, he was working in Auschwitz in spring of '44. I started working on this page at the very end of February 1987. Now we flash forward. In May 1987, Francoise and I are expecting a baby. Then we get figures on how many Hungarian Jews were gassed in Auschwitz. Then in September '86, after 8 years of work, the first part of Mouse was published. That's when he turns to face us. And then the camera pans back. And then we see that the flies have been flying over the mounds of corpses of mice, which by now we immediately go, those aren't mice, those are Jews. And it's certainly drawn in a way that captures those horrific images of mounds of corpses in the concentration camps. So that's what the flies have been flying over. It's whiplash, time travel back and forth at rapid speed, and it comes to a screeching halt. The layout of the panels, the size of the panels is used for maximum dramatic effect. So you really get this collision between past and present, which is what so much of the book is about. Vladek Spiegelman's inability to leave his past behind, how his past is so present to him. And it's even more graphically portrayed in that last large panel, because through the window at the right, we're in Art Studio, but through the window at the right is the guard tower and the barbed wire of the concentration camps. And the last thing is from off page, somebody says, all right, Mr. Spiegelman, we're ready to shoot. Shoot has very ambiguous, again, multiple meanings here. Now, the other thing I want to call attention to is, and it's a reason I wanted to have the whole page up for you to see, there are very peculiar angles in the back of the panels. There are these very, for no reason, there are these straight lines and black shapes. And I only realized this when I read something about Mouse. If you pull back and look at the page as a whole, you have the beginnings of the outline of a swastika in those odd angles. That's very intentional. There are other points in the book where Spiegelman does that, odd angles. He's one of many people who believe things like that visually register, even if not consciously. He's telling us how life for him, for his father, for people in the Holocaust, is constantly in the shadow of the swastika, in the shadow of the Holocaust, even when we're not immediately aware of it. So with good reason, this is a much-studied page. There's a great deal communicated with the interplay between verbal in visual communication. And when I teach it, I am constantly emphasizing how the novel communicates the story. So we can leave that.
I say that there's no visual on the screen. Nobody could see the graphics.
Oh, is that right? So I've been talking about something nobody can see.
That's okay. It was verbally descriptive, but if you could pull
Okay. Well, that's a shame. If you want to check, it's Mouse volume chapter 2 of volume 2. Chapters Time Flies. It's in my edition. It's page 41 of volume 2.
43 in
there. And Stephen is saying that in the edition where both volumes are published together, it shows up as page 43. But it's the first illustrated page of chapter 2 of volume 2.
So they can't see the page.
That's what we were just told.
All right. Well, I don't know why, but let's go back to people can see you. Okay. That same page, by the way, can be used to talk about Art Spiegelman's struggle to create Mouse, because he's at a point in the creation of the second volume of Mouse where he feels overwhelmed by the burden of having to represent an event which he wasn't present to witness. Before we take that up, though, I want to try to go to another page that also addresses Wojtek Spiegelman's being caught in the past, unable to shake free of the Holocaust that he survived. So I want to go, and this is, I think, in many ways an equally famous page, perhaps not as widely reproduced as the one that we just looked at. But Mark, can you see this page on your screen?
Now I can, yes, indeed.
No?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. This is page 110. This is page 110 of volume 1, and I'm not sure why it's blue here, but probably isn't going to make any difference. Here, Wojtek is telling Art about the hiding places that he helped to create when everyone from his city of Sosnowiec was living in the ghetto, but constantly fearful of being arrested during the periodic roundups and raids that were taking place on a regular basis. And he says to his son, the Germans started to grab out anybody if he had papers or no. Therefore, I arranged for us a very good hiding spot in our cellar where it was coal storage. And then he says to Art, show to me your pencil and I can explain you. Interestingly, taking from his son the means by which his son is telling the father's story, such things it's good to know exactly how was it, just in case. And those three words in that bubble are, I think, highly indicative of Wojtek Spiegelman's purpose in sharing his experiences with his son. I'm not telling you this story simply so that you know it, simply so that you can make money off of anything you might do with this story. I'm forewarning you about what you need to know if the Holocaust should happen again, which of course in Wojtek's mind is altogether plausible. And for those of you who know Mouse, it's very clear throughout the work in how many different ways Wojtek Spiegelman is still back in occupied Poland, the way he looks down at the sidewalk whenever he walks, looking for things that he could pick up that might be useful, telephone wire, little odds and ends. But here he makes it very clear that this is a cautionary tale for Art, and he wants Art to know exactly the kinds of things that will help him survive the Holocaust. So I think that's very important. Do you want to talk about page 46, the other one that you wanted?
Yeah, let me just add what we just saw. There's this tension between Art wanting to pull more stories out of his father and his father's resisting. And the way I talked about the graphic novel as a visual medium, there are several points in the story where when Vladek wants to tell Art something really important for survival, how to build a bunker, how to repair shoes, he grabs his pen and pencil. And then words are not sufficient. You have to illustrate. So father and son are in a way united on the importance of showing more than telling, but they don't really think that they have the same viewpoint, but implicit in it is they sort of do about certain things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just to go back to what we talked about earlier, you know, whether to call this comics or graphic novel, Art Spiegelman himself called it comics, but he spelled it C-O-M-I-X, to point out that this was really a mixture of different genres. Yes, it's comics, but it's also maps, it's also drawings, such as the one that Vladek produces here. There are photographs. There's an earlier version of Mouse inserted into Volume 1. It's really a combination of different formats, all designed to try to encompass this extraordinarily complex event, which is too much for words, too much for comics, too much for any single genre, any single medium of expression. So pull up 46.
Yeah. So can this be seen?
I'm going to make it a little bit bigger here.
Yes, it's on the screen.
It should be.
Okay. So this is towards the end of a sequence that starts with the page I talked about earlier, Art at the drawing board. He goes to visit his therapist here, and again, seeing them in masks is not typical of the book. It stands out. It's very different. But it's the section where Art is really struggling with his identity. Can I draw the book? It's the section in which he goes to see a therapist. He's been reduced to a sort of childlike state, and he draws himself as actually smaller in size to indicate that. And it's the same thing at the first panel. His therapist, by coincidence, is also a Holocaust survivor. And in this section, he's saying, you know, I can't begin to imagine what it felt like. I don't know if I can draw this. And the therapist has said, what Auschwitz felt like. How can I explain? Boom! And Art jumps out of his chair. This is, again, you cannot explain. You can just demonstrate. You can just show. If we can get to the bottom of that page, this is Art is leaving his therapist's office. He's gradually returning to adult size. You see, he starts small. By the end of that three-panel sequence on the bottom, he's full size. And again, in the background are these very strange swastika-like shadows. This will show up over and over again in the book. And again, Spiegelman, like many artists, this stuff has a cumulative effect of the awareness of the ever-present shadow of the Holocaust and the swastika, even if we can't identify how come there's this sense of foreboding as we're going through the work. The information is visually communicated.
You know, this page that we're looking at here expresses Art's inability to imagine what Auschwitz was like, and Pavel resorts to a boo to try to communicate it. This is something that comes up periodically in mouse. The difficulty, particularly for someone who wasn't there, of representing this extraordinary event. And I would assume in your copies, this is about page 18 of volume 2, but here Art is driving with his wife Françoise, and he expresses his frustration in trying to represent his parents' story, which is a story that he wasn't there to witness. I know this is insane, but I somehow wish I'd been in Auschwitz with my parents so I could really know what they lived through. I guess it's some kind of guilt about having had an easier life than they did. I feel so inadequate trying to reconstruct a reality that was worse than my darkest dreams, and trying to do it as a comic strip. I guess I bit off more than I can chew. Maybe I ought to forget the whole thing. There's so much I'll never be able to understand or visualize. I mean, reality is too complex for comics. So much has to be left out or distorted. And his wife says, just keep it honest, honey, which of course is really not the point. It's trying to confront a reality that he really can't imagine.
Let me just say, under the heading of additional resources, I'm drawing from an analysis I do of mouse that is actually published. And if people are interested, you can look that up. You can follow through on it. It's a book I published recently. The book is titled "Superman is Jewish."
Let's put it up here, and I just found the webcam.
I can hold it up.
Okay, hold on. I have to get on.
There you go.
People can see you. Okay.
It's the title is "Superman is Jewish: How Comic Book Superheroes Came to Serve Truth, Justice, and the Jewish American Way." There's a chapter on mouse, which includes the stuff that I at least have talked about. Unfortunately, I didn't have Stephen as a collaborator. You'll have to go elsewhere for further examples of his insights. But there is this further analysis along the lines that I've been doing here, if anybody's interested.
One thing we wanted to be sure to talk about, although there may not be time to explore fully this third narrative of the struggle to create mouse, but it's the kind of ethical questions that arise whenever a Holocaust survivor tries to tell his or her story of survival, but even more so when someone else, whether it's a child or someone else, is telling the story with or for a survivor. And I thought we would go to a page from very, very early in the first volume that brings up ethical dimensions of the Holocaust for the first time, and time permitting, we can look at some others here. This is the very last page of Chapter 1 of Volume 1.
It's not on the screen.
You can see the screen?
No.
No?
Try again.
No, you can't see the screen?
Nope. Now I can.
No.
Yes.
Now I can?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In telling about his life before he met his wife Anya, who's Art's mother, Wladek recounted some of his adventures as a bachelor. The title of this chapter is called The Sheik, which refers to the heartthrob of the silent film era, Rudolph Valentino, whom, according to Wladek, many young Polish women told him he resembled. And in the course of talking about his life before marriage, he talks about a girlfriend of his by the name of Lucia, who eventually wouldn't leave him alone. But after he's told Art this story, he has second thoughts and he says, but this what I just told you about Lucia and so, I don't want you should write this in your book. And Art goes, what? Why not? And Wadek said it has nothing to do with Hitler, with the Holocaust. You know, for Wadek, the purpose of telling his story is to talk about his survival of the Holocaust and to tell Art what he needs to be alert to. But from Art's point of view, from the storyteller's point of view, these sort of background stories are what, you know, helps to make everything in the story more human. But Pop, it's great material. It makes everything more real, more human. I want to tell your story the way it really happened. But of course, Wadek is from a different generation. And he says, but this isn't so proper, so respectful. We don't talk about our premarital affairs. I can tell you other stories, but such private things I don't want you should mention. And the last bubble in this frame is, okay, I promise. But of course, the story is there. And so Art has broken his promise. And I think this page, you know, raises the very interesting issue of who the writer of a Holocaust memoir is accountable to. Is he accountable to the person whose story it is, or is he accountable to history with a capital H? You know, telling the story in a way that connects it with the time in which it took place and with history. And this is one of a number of places in Maus where the ethical issues of telling someone else's survival story come to the fore. We need to talk also, at least briefly, about teaching Maus to a non-Jewish audience. I think we agree that for the most part, Maus is very, very accessible to all audiences, particularly because the characters are in the form of animals and are, so to speak, universalized to some extent. But there are some places in Maus where understanding may be difficult for people who haven't grown up in a Jewish tradition. And I think we can look at a couple of examples of this. You want to talk about this one, Harry, with the when Wadek is in a German POW camp, and you want to talk about this one? No?
Go ahead.
No? He's in Wadek was called up into the Polish army. He was a member of the Polish Army Reserves, and very quickly he's captured by the Germans and taken to a POW camp. And while he's at this POW camp, not knowing what his fate is going to be, he has a dream. And in the dream, his dead grandfather, who was a very, very Orthodox, highly religious man, speaks to him and says, you will come out of this place on the day of Parshas Truma. Now, if you're not familiar with Judaism and Jewish observance, every Sabbath during Saturday morning services, a certain portion of what we call the Old Testament, the Torah, is read, and each of these weekly sections is called a Parsha, and each weekly section has a name. This is, Wadek explains this to Art, sorry, let me get this up here. And it turns out that Wadek is in fact released from the POW camp just as his grandfather told him would happen in this dream. And And then he goes on to say, the next page later, when Art says, you mean your Parshas Truma dream actually came true? And Vardek says, yes, this is for me a very important date. I checked later on a calendar. It was this Parsha on the week I got married to Anya, your mother. And this was the Parsha in 1948 after the war on the week you were born. And therefore, according to Jewish tradition, the date on which Art would have his bar mitzvah. And so the date has a tremendous significance in the history of the Spiegelman family. Now, whether that's something that you really want to teach or not, you know, we don't know. But it's an example where Maus kind of steps away from the sort of universal presentation and becomes, you know, much more tied to Jewish tradition. The other example we were going to use of this comes from Volume 2 when Vladek has just entered Auschwitz. Vladek and Anya have just entered Auschwitz and been separated, and Vladek is in his block or barracks, and it's pointed out to him, you see those chimneys? This is how you're going to leave Auschwitz. Okay, so I was more sad, and he's very depressed, and he starts crying, and then someone comes to him and asks, why are you crying, my son? And Vladek explains, well, should I be happy? Am I at a carnival? And the man says, let me see your arm, and you can see that this is a Pole, a Polish Catholic. Vladek tells us he was a priest. And the priest looks at his number, which is 157113, and begins to interpret this number. Your number starts with 17 in Hebrew. That's a good omen. He wasn't Jewish, but very intelligent. It ends with 13, the age at which a Jewish boy becomes a man. And look, add it together. If you add 175113, it totals 18, which signifies life in Hebrew. 18 has a sort of mystical quality. It used to be the tradition that Jewish children would be given birthday presents in multiples of 18, $18, $36. If you go on the United States Holocaust Memorial website, Holocaust Memorial Museum website, and you go to see where you can make a donation, you can still give in multiples of 18. So that tradition is kept alive. And the priest says, I can't know if I'll survive this hell, but I'm certain you'll come through all this alive. And whenever it was very bad, I looked and said, yes, the priest was right. It totals 18. So those are a couple of examples of the relatively small number of times when the Jewish tradition is sort of brought to the fore, you know, these are things to know if you're going to try to teach those parts of Maus. Harry, where do we go from here?
We check it and see if there are any questions.
Well, there isn't necessarily, but let me interact with you guys. The skill that Spiegelman has as a cartoonist is immense. The details of each caption, each segment of every page is tremendously expressive, partly because of how he depicts hands. Take a look at any page, for instance, and the hands are indicators of basic motion, if you've noticed that.
Yeah, he is a very skilled cartoonist, and the skill is exactly in the simplicity of it. I mean, the hands communicate. You know, we know what these people are thinking, and yet all we see is these highly stylized mouse heads. And if you really study his technique, it's extraordinarily subtle variations in the tilt of the head, how the eyes are placed, the body posture. There's an extraordinary amount of information is communicated with an incredible economy, simplicity. And I agree with you, that's the mark of a very skilled artist.
Yeah. The other thing that comes out to me is the fractured nature of the survivor that we know, but the ways it comes out in his discourse with his son. Can you say some more on that topic?
I am going to take a moment to locate a quote from Spiegelman that I use in my book, where he talks about what he's trying to accomplish in the book. He says, the story of Maus isn't just the story of a son having problems with his father. It's not just the story of what a father lived through. It's also about a cartoonist trying to envision what his father went through, which are exactly the three narrative threads that Stephen identified. It's about choices being made of finding what one can tell and what can reveal, and what one can reveal beyond what one knows one is revealing. Those are the things that give real tensile strength to the work, putting the dead into little boxes. The box, the frame format of the medium is part of this junction. And we want to talk about art telling a story, about Vladek telling a story in flashbacks. But that doesn't do justice to it. A flashback actually goes, now we're in the present, now you're in the past. The whole point is that he is simultaneously in the present and the past. And Spiegelman has written about that as part of the comic and the graphic novel form. Here's another quote from Spiegelman. What is most interesting about comics for me has to do with the abstraction and structuring that comes with the comics page. The fact that moments in time are juxtaposed. In a story that is trying to make chronological and coherent the incomprehensible, the juxtaposing of past and present insists that the past and present are always present. One doesn't displace the other the way it happens in film. So this is, again, the eye takes it all in. We travel from panel to panel, but we are aware there's a whole page that is changing time but going on simultaneously. It communicates in a way differently than film does, for example.
Stephen, let me ask you a question. Stephen, Anik talks about his present wife and complains about her incessantly. She has Mala.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
You're talking about Vladek complaints about his present wife.
Complaining about Mala. Do you have a sense that Mala is as wacky as Vladek portrays, or is he over-exaggerating?
Well, I mean, first of all, Mao was his second wife. I mean, he can't, art's not going to fictionalize his own family's history. But one of the things that I think, my students pick up on very quickly when they read about Mala, Vladek's second wife, is that she too is a Holocaust survivor. In fact, she knew Vladek and Anya before the war, and she didn't turn out like he did. The Holocaust didn't turn everyone into the same kind of survivor. She is able to make a distinction between what happened to her in the past and what she wants from her life in the present in a way that Vladek can't, and that he doesn't want to allow her to do either. And so without doing an injustice to the actual biographical facts of the family, you have this very, very important contrast between Vladek as one Holocaust survivor and his second wife as a very different kind of survivor.
Yeah.
What can you enlighten us about the relationship with their son who didn't make it through the war, Rishu?
This is also an ever-present shadow in the book. Art, the presence of the absent brother is one of the most key presences in Art's life, and much of this is about the presence of absence. Art's mother is another figure who, through her absence, is profoundly present all the time. So again, we live our lives in the shadow of a past which is not past. You know, William Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And that is very much in evidence here.
I think Faulkner said something like that. The past isn't dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we run out of time, I know Harry and I both wanted to make sure that everybody knows about a new invaluable resource for learning about mouse and for studying mouse, and that is a book that was published 3 years ago called MetaMouse, which really is a the product of a raid with Art Spiegelman's permission of his file cabinets, and a kind of glimpse into the creative process. And I think it's very interesting. I'm going to pull up a couple of pages from this, because I think Harry talked about the apparent simplicity of the comic format. I think students can often get the misconception that this was something that he kind of just dashed off very quickly in a moment of inspiration, but quite the opposite is true. Many of the pages that we've shown you went through as many as 15 or 20 different drafts, and the book MetaMouse collects all of this draft material that Art Spiegelman preserved. He's really as much of a pack rat as his father was, so that you can see all of the preliminary versions of mouse. Let me just get another one down here. You can see how a transcript from his conversations with his father are literally mapped out onto a page that he's designing, and you can actually see a lot of the creative process. I just want to show one more before we run out of time. Here's where he's trying to deal with the daily routine in Auschwitz, and again you have a transcript from an interview, and then Art making a lengthy list of all of the things that he's prioritized. It's color-coded, you can't see it on here, of absolutely essential to keep in mouse, important if I have space for it, not so important. And you get a tremendous insight into his creative process and the very, very lengthy gestation period of this remarkable work. So I think I speak for both of us. We highly recommend MetaMouse as an important resource for anyone who's going to teach this.
The MetaMouse also comes packaged with a disc, and you can listen to the actual interviews of between Vladek and Art.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you both very much, Stephen and Harry. Stephen, why don't you provide your email address in case people want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, you can see my name up there. It's just my last name, Gaies, G-A-I-E-S, at uni.edu. And you want to give your email?
His name is Harry, H-A-R-R-Y, dot Broad, B as in boy, R-O-D as in David, also at uni.edu.
Okay, thank you both very much. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.